All right, of course, the third game of today is Alireza Firouzja versus Magnus Carlsen from day number 2 of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Tournament. Now, of course, again, this is freestyle chess. Here, the kings are starting on E1 and E8, interestingly enough, but every other piece is on a very, very weird square. The bishops on D1 and C1, the knights on the edge of the board, and so on. All right, here, the strongest moves for white in the starting position are 1c4, 1c3, 1f4, 1e3, and knight f to g3. I mean, it's very interesting. In classical chess, e4 and d4 are the strongest moves, but typically not in freestyle. All right, in the game, 1c4 chosen by Alireza Firouzja, and now we have 1c5 in response by the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. Now, immediately on move 2, Alireza, he decides it is time to challenge that pawn on c5 with the very provocative move b4. Now, the idea behind this, obviously, you are trying to deflect the pawn on c5 away from the center, and you are opening up scope for potentially a bishop on b2 as well. That would be very, very strong. Now, here, black is not messing around. Magnus, he just defends with the move b6, and now you could trade on c5, leading to an endgame on move 3 or 4, essentially. Move 4 endgame. However, instead, Alireza, he is in a fighting mood in this game. Bishop c2 is the response, maintaining the tension on these pawns on b4 and c5, and here black does trade. So, c takes b4, queen takes b4, and then bishop b7. Magnus getting the fianchetto bishop on the b7 square, activating it on that long diagonal. Now we have knight h to g3, jumping in with the knight. And here, Magnus makes the first mistake of the game from black's perspective. Here, black should be going e6 immediately. The point being that queen on b4 is just too dangerous to be kept alive. You want to go e6, then bishop b7, immediately putting pressure on it. But instead here, knight h to g6 chosen in the game, mirroring white, and this turns out to be a very significant mistake. Here, white just goes d4, gaining space in the center of the board, and now black does go e6, again intending bishop e7, but this is just one move too late. And here, white has a lot of ways to put pressure on the black position. The most interesting being bishop to a3. The point being, if you go bishop e7 in response, then you just slide back queen b3 as white, and having that dark square bishop under fire is very, very good for the white position. Instead, in the game, he goes for a more aggressive idea, perhaps e4, getting those 3 pawns in the center of the board very, very strong. Now black, he jumps in with the knight to f4, a very active move by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. What is the idea behind this knight jump? Well, for one, it's very hard to get rid of it. The only pawn that could chase away the knight is that pawn on g2, but it's very hard to move that with it being blocked by the knight on g3. And of course, the queen on b8 does defend it well enough for now. All right, here, Alireza, knight to e3, jumping up with his own knight. And now we have knight 8 g6. Magnus reinforcing his knight with his other knight. And again, that knight on f4 will be very, very hard to get rid of. Yes, white could go, say, knight 3 to e2, for example, but overall, that would not be so strong of a move. And here instead, Alireza, he simply castles short on the king side by dragging his king over 2 squares. Short castles is the move. Now black goes bishop e7, finally putting pressure on that queen on b4. Where is the queen going to go? It goes back to the d2 square, a decent square for the queen. And again, white has very good central control here, but overall, black is sort of counterattacking, sort of in the spirit of perhaps the Sicilian defense, maybe the Taimanov. Black gets a lot of weird moves like this, or weird positions like this in the Taimanov. That is what it reminds me of. So comment down below in terms of what this opening reminds you of in classical chess. All right, here black does castle short as well. Short castles is the move. And then we have bishop b2, exerting pressure on these long diagonals with both of these bishops on b2 and c2. Now here, it turns out the strongest move for black is simply a5, clamping down on the queen side and potentially threatening bishop b4, putting pressure on the queen on d2. Instead, knight to h4 chosen in the game. by the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. A very aggressive move, putting immediate pressure on that pawn on g2. And what is white going to do in response? Well, it turns out that knight on e3 does defend g2 well enough for now. You don't have to freak out. So queen d1 chosen in the game, dropping back with the queen. Now black does the same. Queen d8, getting the queen closer to the king side and also freeing up that c8 square for the rook on the a8 square. Now here, Alireza, knight to h5 is the move, showing one of the ideas of queen d1, eyeing that h5 square and setting up knight h5 ideas, putting pressure on that hanging knight on f4. And what is Magnus going to do about it? Well, it turns out here, he simply trades on h5. Knight takes h5 is the move. Then we have queen takes h5, and then here black goes g6, driving back that queen. But this move turns out to be a little bit dubious. Instead of that, f5 was the right response, simply ignoring the queen for now and immediately counterattacking on the king side, trying to open up that f file. Instead, g6 chosen by the GOAT. And the problem with this move is simply unnecessarily weakens all of these dark squares on the king side, and it drives the queen back to, frankly, a decent square. Queen d1 chosen in the game, a fine square for the queen. And here black does counterattack immediately with the move f5, but it is simply one move too late. It would have been much better to do that without having played the move g6. All right, in this position, d5 chosen by Alireza, gaining space in the center of the board. A very solid move in the spirit of perhaps the king's Indian defense. And now what should black be doing? Well, according to the engine, the strongest move here for black, it's very difficult to find, is actually the move h5, the alpha zero style move, trying to gain space and perhaps get something going on the king side. Instead, bishop c5 chosen in the game, and this turns out to be a very weak move. Here, white simply ignores the threat on the knight on e3, and he just goes g3, driving back that knight on h4. Now here, Magnus, he swoops in with the queen. Queen g5 was chosen, the point being now the pawn on g3 is pinned to the king on g1. You cannot take on h4, as then the king would be under fire. So here, Alireza, he simply slides over with his king to h1, and now what is black going to do? Literally all of the squares the knight could go to, meaning f3 and g2, are being covered sufficiently by the king and the queen, and that means black is simply going to be losing the knight on the h5 square. Magnus Carlsen, due to a simple mistake, bishop c5, he is now losing a piece. All right, here we have the move f takes e4. Magnus ignoring the threat on the knight on h4. Not a bad idea. You're losing it no matter what. At least this way, you do open up the f file for the rook. And here, Alireza, instead of allowing knight h5, he does trade on h4 immediately. G takes h4 chosen in the game, pressuring the queen on g5. Then we have queen takes h4, and then queen g4 flies out with the queen and offers the queen trade. And it turns out here, the greatest endgame player of all time, Magnus Carlsen, he simply cannot resist the queen trade. He flies down with his rook to f4, virtually forcing the trade of queens here. And now we have queen takes h4, then rook takes h4, and then bishop f6, flying up with the bishop and pressuring that weak rook on the h4 square. Now, let's slow down and do inventory. Here, it turns out white is simply up an entire piece, that being the extra knight on e3, and in return, black only has 2 extra pawns. Now, that is a huge advantage for white. Technically, white is only up 1 pawn, but in this sort of position with lots of pieces on the board, that extra piece is just a massive, massive, overwhelming edge. And here the computer says white is up almost 3 pawns in terms of relative strength of his position. All right, here, black, his rook on h4 is under attack. He goes rook h5, trying to defend. And now we have the move bishop takes e4, gobbling up that pawn. White is only down 1 pawn with the extra piece. This is just an overwhelming advantage. It's going to take a miracle for Magnus to hang on in this endgame. But you can't count Magnus out. Stranger things have happened before. All right, black goes rook to f8, sliding out with his rook. Then we have knight g4, defending the bishop on f6. You cannot take it, as then the knight does recapture immediately. Now we have e takes d5, and then bishop takes d5, hitting the king with check and the bishop on b7. Therefore, bishop takes is forced. We have bishop takes, then c takes, and then king to f7. The king centralizing and putting pressure on the bishop on the f6 square. Now white goes rook a d1, centralizing his rook. Black goes rook to e8, doing essentially the same. Now rook d3, the rook lift on the third rank. And again, white being up that extra piece, I mean, he can do almost no matter what he wants in this endgame and still find a way to win. The pressure is on Magnus to somehow force a mistake or force out some sort of concession to claw his way back in this game. All right, here, Magnus, rook to e4 is the move, flying down with the rook and pressuring that weak knight on g4. Of course, if that knight falls, so does the bishop on f6. That is defending it. Therefore, here, white goes f3, the reverse Ben-Feingold counterattack, pressuring the rook and defending the knight in one go. Now we have rook to e2, dropping down with the rook. Of course, the idea of rook takes f4 does not work here. Normally, giving up the rook for the knight and the bishop would be a good idea, but of course, after rook takes, then f takes, the rook on f1 does support the bishop, and you also have the attack on the rook on h5. Therefore, rook takes f4 would not be a good idea at all. Instead, rook e2 chosen in the game. Here, black has a lot of pressure on that pawn on h2, and also the king on h1 is effectively cut off here. Magnus starting to get some sort of play. Alireza, f4 is the move, then rook takes a2, gobbling up that free pawn, then bishop g5, locking out that rook across the fifth rank. Now black goes king to g7, and then we have the move d6 by white. This turns out to be a little bit of an inaccuracy. Instead, simply rook e1, immediately capitalizing on the open e-file, was the right way forward. Instead, d6 chosen in the game. Now the pro of this move, it does cut off the bishop on this diagonal. However, that pawn on d6 is now a very significant weakness, and that bishop on c5 has a lot of pressure on it. Now here, Magnus, he should be thinking about the move rook to e2, gaining control of the e-file before white can go rook to e1. However, instead, h6 chosen in the game, pressuring the bishop, but it turns out this is not a good idea at all. White simply goes bishop f6, putting pressure on the king. The king must move, king f8 chosen in the game, and then here, Alireza, rook to e1, the strong idea, capitalizing on the open e-file once again. All right, Magnus, rook c2, sliding over his rook. He's trying to do everything he can to hang on. Now we have h4, the alpha 0 move, gaining space on the king side, and of course, that pawn on h4, very well defended by the bishop on f6. Now we have bishop to f2, flying down with the bishop. Yes, you can take it, but then black recaptures, and he would have a decent amount of activity. Instead of that, he ignores the bishop and ignores the threat on the pawn on h4, and he flies in with the rook. Rook to e7, Alireza finding the key idea. You must be active with your rooks. Now the rook is threatening, simply rook takes d7, then rook takes a7, gobbling up these pawns as it is a pig on the 7th rank. And now Magnus, he tries to fight back. Bishop takes h4, gobbling up that free pawn. And here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, his persistence, his perseverance has paid off in a big way. And Alireza, he makes a fatal mistake. Maybe not fatal, but it blows away his entire advantage all in one move. Here, the key idea for white is simply bishop g7, forcing the king over to g8, and then you take on d7. Instead of that, here, Alireza, king g1, he slides over his king, and now get a load of this. After that one single mistake, black is going to get a draw by repetition. Rook c1 hits the king. King g2 gets off the back rank. Rook c2. And now here you have a choice. You can go back to g1 or up to, say, f3. You can't block knight f2, as then you lose the knight. If you go to g1, it's just a draw. Both sides go back and forth. If you go to f3, then black takes on f6, bishop takes, knight takes, and then rook to h3, skewering the king and the rook on d3. That is no good as well. So here, white, he simply goes king g1, black goes rook c1, king g2, rook c2, and here, both sides agree to a draw on the spot. There is simply nothing either side can do to avoid the draw by repetition. Wow, what a game between Alireza Firouzja and Magnus Carlsen in day number 2 of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Grand Slam Tournament. Very impressive stuff by both players. So comment down below in terms of what you thought of this game. This game was wild. I mean, Alireza having the key advantage all throughout this game and then blowing it with one simple mistake, the move king to g1 in this position instead of simply, again, bishop g7 followed by taking on d7. I mean, his entire advantage he achieved throughout this middle game blown in one single move, and Magnus, the swindler, somehow getting a draw out of essentially a completely losing position. I mean, completely wild stuff.